This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And first of all, I wanted to say that we have a neighbor that has orchids, and they have done their blooming, and they're ready to come forth in a new year with another set of blooms. And they need a home for that year. And so if any of you are out there willing to house some interesting orchids for a while, they need a home. So as usual, we try to recycle items that are valuable, and sometimes it's hard to find a friendly user of a piece of equipment or somebody to put a screw into to a chair or something. But we managed to recycle a lot of things, and so orchids are what we're at the moment. In real life, I have to say that I have a van outside that has a flat, and I cannot get the lug nuts undone. I can get all four, but the fifth one is very hard to do. So it's just one of those things of real life that I relay every once in a while. So you try to put 40. It's a release, rust release on them, and so we've been working at it, and hopefully we'll get the wheel off and put a spare on. But little things that one has to do when you don't expect to have to do them. So I thought today I'd say something about the railroad bed between Urbana and Danville that was removed by Conrail some years ago and will become the Kickapoo Trail. This was Peoria and Eastern Line that ran from Danville right through Bloomington to Peoria, and was an established corridor for freight until about 20 years ago. It had been New York Central, it had been Conrail. It was Conrail when it was closed out. The corridor is still of interest to people because there is this possible connection between Chicago and St. Louis and Bloomington in the middle and Indianapolis on the other end. So it's not only that we're interested in bikeway networking, but we're also interested in railroad networking. The railroads are reasonably efficient. They can move 1 ton of freight on 1 gallon of gas, almost 500 miles, and they can do it with one driver at 80 miles an hour and with a safety record that exceeds anything on the road. And it's a different era. Those trains are sometimes semi-trailers stacked up on each other, so they have rail wheels under them so that they can be disconvolvulated when they get to their destination, or they can be intermodal trains, which are trains that are loaded with boxes or shipping crates that are all the same size, and they can come in from Asia and to Los Angeles and then be loaded with gantry cranes. This is instead of having a yards where you push freight cars together like grain cars and distribute them. The stunt was to have a little hill and it was called humping. You pushed your train with mixed freight, and you wanted it to go in different directions, so you had someone who would open the line, and then there was a bottle of perhaps 10 or so rail lines into which the truck could flow. So if it was on the downgrade, it ran itself and found its location. By the time it got there, it was moving fairly slowly, but sometimes it could be kind of a rough trip because it would bang into what used to be buffers early on. Railroad cars had buffers so that you banged into them. They were on springs, and that absorbed some of the shock. But you could imagine that this sort of freight movement could not handle things like computers or photographic equipment or delicate items, because there was this rather various junction. Those yards were also fairly unsafe because you had to have someone to couple the trucks, and it was very easy to get caught in between trucks coming together to a train. So the humping yards have been largely, they're not totally replaced, but they've been largely replaced by intermodal trains where you load onto the train with a gantry crane. And gantry crane is a crane that moves along the railroad train, and then it can move horizontally also. So it can pick up a shipping crate like in the middle of the train and move it across to a train that may be going in another direction. These yards are about 300 mile apart. So we have big yards in Chicago, and the next yards will be Memphis, and the next might be Atlanta. So if you're going to send stuff to Miami or other places, you would have those trains assembled, but they wouldn't be trains that were assembled on a humping style. They would be put together by these cranes, and at places like Memphis, they have something like 5 of these huge cranes that run across corridors and drop shipping crates on different trains. You see them going past Champaign. They're usually about a mile long. So there is a problem of stopping these trains. That's a lot of energy to stop and then start again. So there's a temptation to have them do 3 through passage. That means that passenger trains often have to wait on the side, and that let those trains move through, because they're worth millions of dollars in terms of the freight that's on them, and it does really cost to start them up again. You can see the trains moving out of Champaign to the south. There's a lot of energy involved in just getting to 1 mile an hour, 2, and then gradually up, and you might have 2 engines pulling that. Yesterday I saw one train with 7 engines. I wondered why 7. I suspect that some of those engines are dead engines that are going to the south to storage or to repair. The climate is better for that in the south. But a train that is longer than that also stops the traffic from going through, like at Bradley Avenue in Champaign. If you have a mile-long train and it's only just getting started, it causes a lot of frustration. And there's no real place where you can put a bridge over the railroad. But we still do have a humping yard there. It doesn't have a hill, but it's a yard where you could assemble trains and with about 10 tracks. So the freight trains come through, and they may pick up some cars. Usually it's not a 1-car or 2-car effect. Usually the Mainline trains like to pick up 25 cars or 75 cars if they can. It's quite a jolt. There are sidelines, like there's trains that come in from grain lines, like from Bonneville, from Kraft or other places like that, to join the main line. The freight advantage at the moment is on main lines, but in the east and on the west, they've sort of been solving the problem of accumulating cars and getting to have batches of 25 cars at once. If you have enough cars, the mainline trains will take the engine or have a yard engine and go pick up your cars. Otherwise, the short line people often have an engine of their own that will move 25 cars. It might not be the biggest engine, but it's enough to get a coupling worth putting on. So that means that a train coming through Champaign will stop for a while to add cars on or take cars off. But basically the train is moving to places like Memphis, where they will be unloaded and reloaded onto other trains depending on where they're going. So in the era of deregulation, which was sort of in the 1980s, trains were regarded a little bit as old-fashioned. They really weren't, but they were sort of regarded as a historic way of moving freight because they are not as convenient as a semi-trailer. A semi-trailer can go from your depot to the depot where they will be unloaded. So there's a convenience factor there, and the price of gas was not that much a problem. But as the price of gas went up to $3 a gallon, the railroads were tending to have a huge advantage over semi-trailers and trucks. So especially on long hauls, like between Los Angeles and New York, you would be putting the semi-trailers off the road. It's interesting that right now, as the price of gas has gone way down, the freight trains are not as much at an advantage. So we're anticipating that the road traffic for heavy semi-trailers will change if that price stays low. But even so, there is a lot of popularity for railroads, especially for freight. And the University of Illinois has a center for research and utilization of rail cars and dealing with the trackage, the quality of the steel, the load bearing of the wheels, the axles, the weight of the train on the rail bed. Should it be gravel? Should it be country rock that is brought in? Should it even have some asphalt on it? So the railroads that are being used to transport freight are being upgraded. For instance, if you come from Virginia to Chicago, there used to be quite a few tunnels, and they have been raised so that trains with double-stacked shipping containers can go through them. They also have upgraded trestles and bridges to take intermodal trains. That has broken the length of that trip from West Virginia to Chicago by about 2.5 hours. So we're talking about an efficiency We're also talking about people movers, but the people movers are somewhat at a disadvantage because they're heavily subsidized, and that means there's a cost to the state and the federal government. So you look for corridors that are used a lot if you're going to use people movers. And you also need to have double trackage, especially in some places, so that the people movers and the freight movers can pass each other. Well, 20 years ago, the line between Crawfordsville on Indiana side to Bloomington and to Peoria was closed out, abandoned. A notice goes into the newspaper. There are various levels of preservation of this line. Corridor can be reused for rail, but if it's abandoned, it's already gone through that process. No one has bought it. In their wisdom, the federal government decided to use bikeways as a method of saving railroad beds. And that was a creation of a rail banking act that provided bicycle and greenway and hiking people with an interim trail. And they could have that possibly for 50 years or 100 years for a corridor to preserve the usually about 100-foot wide corridor. As prairie people or habitat people, the 100 feet included a ballast in the middle to carry the railroad line, but that ballast was usually put in linearly, so it didn't disturb the prairie on either side, except where you had to make a causeway or some sort of mound, and then you would take, it's called borrow, you would borrow from the sides. But at that time, when the railroads were going in the 1850s, that material was adjacent to unused agricultural land or land that was basically prairie. So either the prairie stayed or it came back into those corridors. So you were saving the railroad bed, you were saving the bicycle, giving the bicycle people a use, and you were saving the habitat on either side. It's interesting that the habitat has been saved basically because people couldn't, by law, take over that little 100-foot of railroad bed. It was illegal to work onto the railroad line. That meant that by happenstance, the railroads were the preservers of a lot of habitat, especially where the soils on either side of the railroad line are like in Illinois, glacial soils that are very, very rich, and every inch is worth money for agriculture. It started out with livestock, but very shortly it became row crops, corn and soybeans, and perhaps a little wheat, because the land was more productive and economically feasible for row crops. Livestock remained some around rivers and creeks and terrains that were awkward, that didn't get to be cultivated so easily. So we still do have a livestock industry, but most of anything that can be cultivated is into row crops, except for the railroad bed. So the rail from Bloomington to Champaign and Urbana was still active at this time, and Norfolk Southern bought from Bloomington to east of Urbana, but the piece from Urbana to Danville became a Rail Banking Act interim trail use. That was 20 years ago, and Heartland Pathways did that with the perspective that Champaign County is relatively flat, very fertile, and it doesn't have the attraction of terrain that is in Vermilion County, where there are strip mines and hills and vales that you don't have in Champaign, or Piatt County, where you have the like of the Sangamon River and Allerton Park, or DeWitt County, which is west toward Clinton, where there was a Clinton Power Plant Lake, and also a terrain that's interesting. So recreators and people who would like to use those trains that are in Champaign and at the University of Illinois are often oscillating to those areas. So it's pretty logical to take advantage of a state park at the Danville end and a corridor to Champaign, and that corridor would save the prairie that was on either side of the rail bed, and it was a trail that was fairly simple. Freight trains don't go up and down hills very easily, so it's usually very flat, and bridges across areas that are not so flat, and they don't bend around corners very easily either. So these are not trails that test your physical pizzazz. This is not your place where you go up and down a hill and skid around and go through mud and things like that. So this is not a circuit for bicycles that do wheelies or want to physically challenge themselves in an environment. This is a fairly flat, straight corridor that joins towns, and those towns in our situation are Urbana, St. Joseph, Ogden, Muncie, Fithian, and I think Fithian becomes before Muncie, and then Oakwood and into Danville. Before you move into Danville, you have to realize that the rail bed was not curtailed at Danville. There were yards or still are yards in Danville that were assembly yards, and usually you keep about a mile behind the yard so that you can put a mile-long train there. So conveniently, when you get to Danville, before you get to Danville, you go over a bridge which is 160 feet high. It's over the Vermilion River. And just at the end of that, there is a county fairground and there is a state park. So the trail that we have from Urbana to Danville will access into the park rather than going straight through to Danville. If you did get a chance to run a trail on that backed up mile of land with rail on it for storage of cars, you would have to go through a little town called Hillary, where the residents are almost right up onto the railroad line, and that engenders a bunch of conflict between the local people and the bikers and hikers that you might want to move along there. For instance, there are dogs and there are people, and you would have to go through quite a few years of diplomacy to create a trail. You can create a trail, but the people that live in those places aren't usually the people who can afford a backpack and bicycle equipment. So this trail will end at the fairgrounds, and the road will go down into the state park. Well, let's go back to abandonment. Once we made an agreement to buy this line, and we had time to buy it, we had to have an agreement with the railroad, which was Conrail, and we had to guarantee to buy in a certain time. That enabled us to watch what was happening to the line. So the yards in Urbana were kept with a mile-long access, and so the railroad bed that Norfolk Southern bought goes round to Dobbins Drive, which is almost near to Main Street, as Main Street goes on to 150. That little piece is in limbo at the moment because the trail, I think, will start somewhere between Main Street and Route 130, which is where Walmart is. And so if you're putting on your thinking caps, you have to think about how you get a bicycle coming from Urbana along Main Street, past Weaver Park, past the Quakers, past the junction of Main Street and Route 150. If you want to have an assembly place, do you make it also a natural history place? Do you make it a place where people come and congregate? There are various people who are quite willing to help with the development of a facility at the start of the trail. Well, before we get to a trail, we have to know that the railroad is keeping the rail 1 mile east of Urbana to Dobbins Drive. Then we waddle down 150 to 130, which is the major drag road that goes south towards Villa Grove. Now, at that point, you're still dealing a little bit with the Yankee Ridge Moraine. So there is a little terrain there, and there is prairie there. But the last train started at about Dobbins Drive. Well, before you get a train to come through like that, you have to have the plates and the spikes removed. You leave enough plate and spike in to allow an engine to come through and not fall off the tracks. But you have machinery that takes those spikes out and loosens up the track. The last train through is a long one. It's 1/4 mile long, and usually there are several cars, empty cars, between the cab of the engine and the load that it will take. The cars are like an intermodal train. They're going to be loaded onto. They have racks for rails, and there is on the last of these 1/4 mile set of cars, like a washing machine wringer. It's you lift it. It has a little crane, and it lifts one end of the rail up and winds it through these cars. There might be 20 or 30 cars, and it's 1/4 mile long, and there's lots of screeching and screaming as this material is lifted, and you have to make sure that you don't have the spikes and plates with it. And you have to know that the reason for those spare cars between the engine and the load is that if you were to stop this train in transit suddenly, then you just might have a load of rail coming through your cab. So there's a buffer zone there. And so gradually you take up another quarter of a mile, and so on, until you get to St. Joe, and in this case, the engine failed. So you had to take the engine back to Danville and gather up another engine and come back. So then the process continued. There are sidelines that have to be taken out. Sometimes it's an overnight process, so you leave the engine parked on the sideline, but eventually the sideline will come out too. The intent of collecting the rail is that it's a very valuable steel, and it's quite reusable, and it goes to places like New York where you take stick rail. Stick rail is 33 feet long, and it's joined together by units that have bolts in both sticks. So you undo those bolts and allow a quarter of a mile of track still bolted together to come up onto the train. And then when the train is full, it goes to places like New York where they cut the bolt holes off and weld the rails together. So modern railroads do much better with welded rails. It means that the wheels that have weight on them don't pressure down one stick rail or the end of one stick and whack into the stick on the advance edge, which leads to breakage and to derailments. So welded rails are preferable, and they will come back to other railroad situations, and they will be dropped by the same sort of train that will leave a quarter mile of welded rail, and then when it's installed, that welded rail will be welded. So you will have actually miles and miles of welded rail. You still have to keep it in place because that rail will heat up. If it's 100-degree temperature, the rail will expand. If it's cold, it will decrease. So it's held together by plates and spikes, just the same way as the stick rail was held together. I have to add that underneath the rail bed, there are plates, and there are units that are tied into the steel that stop the ties from moving horizontally. You wouldn't want all your ties stacked up in one place and none in another place. So there are clips to stop horizontal movement. There are bars which assure the width of the rail. So these pieces have to be taken out independently. After the track is moved up onto the train, the plates are joined together, and then there's a pile of plates at each little town or nearby burg. They're rather vulnerable because people can take them and salvage them, which is illegal to do anymore, but that used to happen. So you have a pile of plates, and the plates are designed for the weight of rail that you had. So if you have 136 pound per yard rail, it's very heavy. That's a main line. If you're working with an interurban train, you have a very light rail, which might be 65 pounds per yard. You could almost lift a yard of that. Underneath the plates, there are ties, and usually those ties were put in the 1850s, and some of them have been replaced. The early tie makers had lots of forest to work with, and they worked with saws and adze, and they made ties that were very weatherproof. You would take a tree and saw it up so that the grain was interesting, but then you would take an adze and make it so that the tie might be a little curly, would be protected from weather. Then you would take an adze, which is where you spread your feet and you smooth the tie horizontally. And so there are pieces of equipment that were used for handmade tiles, and there's 2,000 ties per mile. 2,000 ties per mile. We don't have those sorts of trees anymore. But the tools were, first of all, hand saws, which might be 6 feet long, with a man on either end. You would fall a tree. Then you would saw it. And in the early days, you did that by standing in a pit. You had a pit, and the wood, the tree was on top of that pit. And so the man underneath was receiving sawdust, and the man on top had to figure out how to stay on top of a log that might be 2 feet across. So that log was hand sawed. Then you would have blocks of material that needed to be hewn with a broad axe. So a broad axe has a really broad face, and it can be left-handed or right-handed, depending on who's using it. And that tidies up the surface. Then you have an adze, and there are all sorts of helpful pieces of equipment that are used. One of them is that's very, very handy if you're working with railroad ties, is a pair of tongs. These are tongs that you put into the tie and move it. And people who move ties have an efficiency that is very, very interesting to watch. They don't lift a tie as such. They lift one end of the tie and put it down where they think it ought to be. Then they go to the other end and use tongs to lift that. And that gives them a chance to not have to break their backs lifting ties. Now, if you have two people with tongs on either end, you probably can lift and throw the tie. But another technique is to have a little push bar, and you put it between ties so that you can get that tong in. Before the ties are taken out, they're dotted. You take a spray can, yellow, red, blue, and you note the value of the tie. If the tie has been there for 100 years and it's broken down, that is sometimes a scrap tie that won't be used for anything. If it has some splits in it, it will be perhaps useful as a landscaping tie. And there are various levels. If you have one split only, it's more valuable than if you have 2 or 3 splits. Sometimes the splits are held together by a little S-shaped piece of steel, which is hammered into the end. These ties are interesting. They have dates on them. There's a little nail. If you walk old railroad lines, you'll find each tie, or every so often, there will be a nail in the tie to give an idea of the date. Well, the dots are put on these ties so that good ties that can be relayed are sorted out. Once the track is up, there's a move to remove the ties. Usually, it's like a huge snowplow, and you push through the ties and push them to one side or the other. And then bobcats and other pieces of equipment, including bulldozers, can lift those ties into piles, usually 9 ties to a pile, and they have a band of steel around them, and they go off in various directions. Whether they're landscaping, they'll go to a landscape sales unit, or to relay, they go to replacement areas or to new railroad lines. And new railroad lines are being put into industries that need the railroad line. So those ties are used. Actually, those ties are fairly scarce, so they're worth probably $45 each. And they're sometimes replaced by concrete or steel because we're out of trees. But also with concrete and steel, you can get a more effective compression of the bed underneath and the connection to the rail itself. There are clips that hold the eye-shaped rail together. And you learn little things like you can date the rail that you're going to put in or preserve should not be too worn. You know that because you can take your fingers and find how the steel has been rolled over. It sometimes has been welded several times at each end where a railroad wheel, especially a big old steam engine wheel, has bumped into the next rail. So that has been re-welded. So the rails are also judged. Well, once you get the ties out, you have stations where there are thousands of ties, and as a sales unit, and there is a truck that is very, very useful. It runs along the railroad line. By now, you have moved the rails to either side, and the ties are there, and there are very few spikes in the railroad bed itself. So semi-trailers can be moving along this corridor without destroying their tires. And trucks can be used to pick up the plates and the spikes, and so there's a lot of movement along the line. At this time, the line is actually very easy to use for a bicycle because the tracks are there. So very shortly, you hope you have picked up all the steel. If not, that's a little dangerous, and if you happen to be running a railroad line to check it out, which you can do very easily with a little Datsun or a small car, you have to be very careful about turning around on a railroad bed because each side may have some leftover spikes that you don't want to encounter. But you can rumble your way across bridges and find your way along. I did some riding on the train itself that was taking out the steel. The driver has usually a lot of experience, and just in case a driver goes to sleep, there's a little wiggle stick that he has to wiggle every so often to make sure that he's alive and kicking. And so that train moves through, and there's crews of people behind that are helping to load it and to move on to the next step. The track is now free and available for further discussion. In our case, we weren't able to get the money needed to buy the line from Conrail. So CSX bought the line, and CSX then had control of the 100-foot wide territory plus the bridges. The Rail Banking Act meant that the bridges and the bridges were saved, which is a bridge like the one over the Vermilion River is 160 feet off the ground, and it's a quarter of a mile long with 998 ties in it. And the bridge ties are much bigger than any railroad tie on the ground. They're usually about 10 feet wide and about 10 by 10 inches in cross section. When the rail is taken out, the bridge is sometimes a little less stable because the rails, in fact, have been keeping the bridge together as well as the bridge keeping the rails together. So if you put a bulldozer across the bridge, you can feel the bridge moving. And you have to be careful, because if you fall off the bridge, you die because it's 160 feet. But people who work those territories can run the corridor. A bridge often has steel underpinning I-beams, and so wherever there's a junction, there's a set of bridge ties at each junction. So if you are running across that bridge, you have to hop and go one. When you come to if you're putting your feet on the ties, they're regular for the length of the I-beam, but where it joins, there's a set of ties. So you have to get used to changing your gait. Once the tracks are out, the bridge ties, which are very valuable, are vulnerable because each railroad plate has 3 spikes in it usually, and they've been taken out, which means that any water that falls into those holes is going to rot this valuable plate. So what we did at Danville and other bridges was to put special blocks of wood. They're little cut-off pieces of wood that you drive into the spike hole. So I and others have managed to put plugs in all the spike holes on 998 bridge ties on that bridge. That has saved them, and you have to know that this is very high. So what we started to do was to drop in ties between the bridge ties, because we would take friends and relatives to see this bridge, and very shortly after they got 25 feet off the ground, they were lowering their bodies and sitting on their backsides and crawling across it, because this is not what people are used to doing. After a while, you get used to it. And you could drive a car across. We used to drive our tools and car across that bridge. I'm watching the clock here to see how much time we have. But you're getting an idea of what it's like to take out a rail bed and make it available for trails. CCDC in Urbana Park District. CCDC is the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation. kept working at this, and eventually working with the state and the federal authorities, and still using the Rail Banking Act, which gave enhancement money, they've eventually bought the line. And the quid pro quo for the railroads is that they can come back if necessary. So when you plan and modify a railroad bed for a trail, then you should have some sort of sympathy for the fact that this might one day go back to being a railroad. It might be for an interurban, or it might be that a factory goes in at a place like Danville, or it's sometimes very dependent on what political people want to do. Do they want to go back from Bloomington on the fast track that goes from Chicago to Bloomington to St. Louis? Do they want to join that with Crawfordsville and into Indianapolis? So the railroads have their interest, the federal and state governments have their interests, and the locals have their interest. If you're going to have a new car factory in your backyard, you may want to reactivate the rail. So that's why the Rail Banking Act, and so CSX or others, railroads, may want to at some stage buy the land between Urbana and Danville. That's okay. There's probably about 1,500 of these trails across the country now. They do save the railroad beds, but there hasn't been a big movement to take them back as railroads. The railroad efficiency is mainly on the main lines. So they haven't done a lot with the sidelines. And there's some problem with thinking about things like fast tracks for people moving, because the open nature of the Midwest means that there's not big populations of people on these lines. So to install something like a fast track like you have in Italy or Japan or France or other places, it's not moving through a gazillion of populations. So it's not likely that we'll get fast tracks installed quickly, even though academia would like to be able to get to Chicago quickly so that they can spend a day in Chicago with their friends and relatives and come back to town. So there's been some discussion of that. But rest assured that this is a temporary trail, which might be temporary for a long, long time. So it's worth working on. So the planners are working on that, and it will be about 2 years before the corridor is available for use, but it will probably be useful in little places, say St. Joe to Fithian or something like that. But I think we're toward the end of the program. This is, remember that we have some orchids that could do with at home. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.